So relevance in a world with bigger problems discussion. It was going to be relevance part 3, and then the world changed, and Greg very quickly came up with a new title. So we're happy that you could join us in our different annual meeting this year. And you've probably seen this if you've been in a meeting so far today, but so sessions and chat activity are being recorded. Use chat and select everyone to ask questions, share comments, responses to questions, and another word that is behind a thing, and resources. Definitely for resources. If you have any links to drop into the chat, that is helpful. And I think at least at the beginning, we're going to have you use go to your participants tab and use the raise hand feature, which is, where is raise hand? I can't see it because I'm a co-host, but when you go to the participants tab, you should have a raise hand option, and that will let us know that you would like to unmute and speak. And then there we go. This is Greg's slide to go through, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so making sure everybody should know how to mute. It looks like everybody's on mute. That's important for right now, but more importantly is how to unmute, because this is a discussion. So we want to have a back and forth, as we're saying, raise your hand, shake the screen, whatever gets our attention so that you can get into the conversation. We want to try and be respectful as well. So cross-talking and that kind of thing. Let's, try and be cognizant that there may be a lag for some people. So let's all work together. For polls and to be called upon, we'll use that function in the participant tab. The chat area, you can post questions, links, all of that. So I think we covered a lot of this. We do encourage pants, even though we can't see them. A favorite beverage, as we've discussed. And an open mind. We're going to talk about topics that may be difficult. So we want to make sure that we're being respectful and open at the same time. Okay, a lot of people don't have video on. If you are able, we do encourage it.
I would just like to point out, I did do a quick Google of going south, and according to dictionary.com, it is alluding to two-dimensional maps where north is up and south is down. However, among some Native Americans, the term was a euphemism for dying, and possibly this since led to the present usage, and it was used as slang in the first half of the 1900s. So there we go. Google is our friend. All right, everybody, welcome. Hello. So as Greg said, we are going to be running this as a conversation. It's not a presentation like the last 2 years. So we want to take a couple minutes to do a recap of how we've approached relevance in the first 2 sessions. And Greg can handle that in a second. And then we are going to have you put into the chat section specific topics or questions that you would like to see answered during the session. And we're going to try to clump them and get to as many as possible. All right. So Greg, do you want to do a recap?
Sure. So in the last couple of years, we've talked about relevance, the idea that historic organizations, museums, sites, particularly house museums, which is where the discussion started, were falling out of relevance in that we weren't having the school groups coming as much, and we weren't, being asked in as much. We didn't have the tours happening as much. The attendance was down. Membership is down. So that led us to this discussion of why and how do we get to the next level? How do we make ourselves, hip again, if you will? So it was a discussion about making tough decisions, reviewing the membership of your board, reviewing your membership in general, reviewing how you use your resources, making tough decisions as to whether those things should or should not still be put to the fore. So it was a discussion where we wanted to try and push organizations to make those tough decisions and to look at those things critically. Then we kind of punched in the face a little bit. So the last one was, go make these tough decisions. And our third and final session will be about how things worked over the last year and where we're going from there. Then, as Tyson says, it's attributed to Tyson anyway, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. So we all got punched in the mouth with COVID, and then a double, a right hook of social injustice that has brought us to a very poignant discussion where we were on the iceberg tip of that discussion with those two relevance talks. But now we are all forced into making those decisions, difficult choices, sometimes Sophie's choices as to, what you're going to keep and cut. And we're talking about relevance in the same breath that we're talking about organizational survival. We were, talking about how can we stop from plugging along and, grinding our wheels in this slow decline to that decline might be happening right now. So we are trying to talk in this discussion a little bit more about our response to COVID, what's worked, what hasn't, and then also our response to social injustice, how our voices are being heard. I'm going to reference my notes a little bit. So how do we plan for a world where we need to limit group sizes when our ethos was bringing people together in our educational programs, bringing people together in our fundraising programs, and sharing a collective history together? We were talking about how do we get more and more people into our sites. Now we're talking about how do we keep them out? How do we tell the story of our very biased and usually very white histories that are discriminatory against people of color, and find ways to welcome them into the conversation, to help us survive? And then that being said, we honor a lot of our founders, and a lot of our house museums are based on the house that survived the longest because the rich white people lived there. And that's kind of the story we tell a lot. So we also need to, talk about how do we tell the other stories without losing those pieces of, the story that are important to why that house is still standing, but also tell everything else around it. And then, how do we do that in a way that's not pandering, condescending, or disingenuous? And then what is the role of history museums, history sites in our communities right now? Are we bystanders collecting history for future generations? Are we repositories? For a lot of us, we haven't been able to be in our museums or our archives. We haven't been able to, we've been working remotely. So it's been difficult to even do that collection. And then are we change leaders, leveraging our assets to promote, and support social justice? Are we somewhere in between those two things? Are we, cutting the edge? Are we, standing by? Are we, that's a loaded term these days. Sorry, that's fresh. So where are we in that discussion? Where are we as a community in that discussion? And where are we in our communities about that discussion? So I'll kick it over to Terrie.
Okay. So take a couple seconds, and if there is a particular question or issue or topic related to this that you want to make sure that we discuss, you've got some amazing people in this room with you, and now is the time to have these conversations. So if you want to add those to the chat, we'll sort of look through those and try to pull a few out. We do have about 40 participants on the screen, which can be a lot, but it would be best if we can try to stay together. If not, we do have a plan to break us into 2 groups randomly, but we're going to see how this goes first. Okay, so take a second. I see that Judy's already added something to the list, but is there something in particular, or frankly, has COVID passed you by and you're not impacted by it, and frankly, you are already on the path of change of your board, per last year's conversation. So first of all, where is the magic lamp that you rubbed, and can you share it? And second, maybe you have a different question to ask. So just take a second, see if anybody's put anything else in there. Come on. And while you're doing that, I'll share that I have a new foster dog. He's sleeping. So that's a COVID change for me. We're fostering dogs. I'm assuming that there are several cats and dogs and possibly children running around your households if you're working from home. So if we hear them, oh, Sarah's got one right behind her head. If we see or hear them, it's okay.
While we were talking about this session, before the first of the year, it was very upbeat and, having this fun discussion. And then things got dark in the last few weeks when we've been going back and forth about how does this go. So we want to hear both sides. We want to hear the light and the dark. So don't be afraid either way. This is a safe space. We're not going to judge you. However, we do want you to remember that it is being recorded. So keep that in mind.
There's some good questions coming up. So while we'll give everybody a couple more minutes to add any more, and if something pops up while we're having a conversation, go ahead and add it to the chat, all right? This is ongoing. Let's see. And I'm not saying this is a shameless plug, but it's a shameless plug. In this recent issue of the Local Historian, I did an article where I interviewed very unscientifically my summer work crew about their experience with history and historic sites. And it was an interesting response from them regarding a lot of what we're talking about here. One of them actually was very key to say, make sure you tell people what you stand for. And it sort of put me aback because earlier this year, Region 8 had these Zoom sort of conversations each month. And I'm not sure if Shelby's on here or not. It doesn't look like it. We talked about that, about how do we as these historic sites, as museums, as institutions, fit into some of these conversations morally, but also with a recognition that we have generally an older skewing, more conservative skewing donor base. So that's something we can discuss as well, is when you're trying to become more relevant because this younger generation is asking it of you, but you are still sort of tethered to a demographic that is not looking for that kind of change. So, all right, so let's look at some of the questions here. We've had two that are sort of the same about representation. Basically, how do you include representation of non-white histories when your community is predominantly white? So there's a split, is one where it's predominantly white, but two is they're predominantly white, but they're feeling connected to the story and inaccurately. So there's that education piece. So one, how do you weave in those stories? And two, how do you make sure that those stories that are used are accurate, and you might have to do some community correction? So anybody want to start with that? First of all, raise your hand, and let's try out the raise your hand function. Raise your hand if you, your institution is in a community that, I'm going to say is at least 85% white. Let's see who all raises their hand. I don't see a raise your hand function. Wait, there's more. Oh, there is. I
think co-hosts don't have a raise hand. I'm not sure why, because I don't have it either. So
Yeah, me
Oh,
neither.
it's under more. I found it.
There's like we have the clapping, but which probably, serves just as well.
Okay, we got several people who did not raise their hand. Interesting. Okay, for those of you who are in communities that are predominantly white, does anybody want to share how you are engaging with representation? Anybody have a success story, first of all? And put your hands down so we know who's raising their hand now. Oh, it is clapping, isn't it? Anyone? Okay.
I think Ingrid was first.
Ingrid. Yeah, Ingrid.
So this is a story from, I guess, 1 or 2 summers ago when I was volunteering at the site that I'm currently at now. And the exhibit we put on was called Hidden Landscape, Hidden Diversity. And so the whole aspect was thinking about like the places in the region that have maybe been underrepresented in museum settings, first off, and then looking at the history of people that have lived there. And so it included kind of migration and immigration stories of Hungarians and Germans and Italians and African Americans, and looking at those communities. And so I think just the way it was presented worked really well with that. And so it became, it seemed like very available kind of history to understand for people of all backgrounds who are from this region who wanted to learn more, because we never really talked about that in school. And so I found that very interesting to work on as a volunteer.
Before we move on, because I see Stacey's got her hand up, question for Ingrid would be, was it success? Did you see, were your typical visitors, guests, intrigued by this enough to come to a story that wasn't theirs? And did you also see, sorry, Stacey, and did you also see an increase from non-white attendees coming through because they finally saw themselves in your stories?
I really wish I had the answers to those. I don't really. I think if I had been working at front desk, I could answer that correctly. But I mean, I only heard good things about it. And yeah, so, but from what I observed, it seemed to go over well. And at least I personally found it interesting, and the people that I showed it to also found it interesting. So, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have want to share? It doesn't have to be a success story. It can be, where you've tried something, and it didn't work the way you had intended.
Donna has her hand raised.
Donna.
Hi. I was just wondering about telling stories of why your area is so predominantly white, because a lot of areas in Ohio were not always that way. Either indigenous people or African Americans that were freed before the Civil War, or immediately following, moved into Ohio and were farming and different things. So I think there's probably a lot of history that's maybe not very pretty about why these areas are now so completely white. Just because I've run into that when I worked with museums out in the field, and they just, well, we don't have any people of color here. Really? Ever?
Yeah. So we deal with that quite a bit, and it's a semantics issue. We have the city of Lakewood is smaller than its original township of Rockport, so it was carved out of a piece of it. We talk about Rockport history and then roll right into Lakewood history. However, when we talk about the people that were living here, we talk about our house that we have that is still standing, and it's the Nicholson House, and we call them the first permanent residents of Lakewood. Well, they were early settlers of Rockport, and we make that differentiation because the borders were put up, but the first family in Rockport was a Black family, and George Peak, and he had a very successful farm, and his family was, fairly successful, and they had a lot of property just south of the border of what would become Lakewood, but was originally Rockport. So we're trying to figure out right now, how do we bring that story back into the fold and stop the tap dance of semantics around the first permanent residents of the Nicholsons, who happen to be white instead of George Peak, who was Black and gets pushed out of that history. So we're working on how to fill that hole in our story. I don't know that we have a good answer at the moment. We have a house for the Nicholsons, and we can point at it and say that's the Nicholsons' house. We don't have anything from the Peaks. We barely have stories from the Peaks, and honestly, the stories that we do have are coming from newspapers that were not kind to them. If there was a dispute, the newspaper did not take the Peaks side of any dispute. So that's been, difficult for us to find the history and to be able to pull it out. So it is taking a lot of digging, and we're continuing that process.
And this does go to the sort of thought that Greg started with, is especially this summer, where there is so much happening around the issues of racism, race relations. You're finally having some conversations about what the systemic racism and institutionalized racism. And right there in that is the word institution, and which we are, and we're supposed to be public institutions. And it brings up, how do we then handle being a public institution in these communities where, if you look at a lot of our own history, we're not even talking about this. Do we have a role to play? I'm sort of talking a little bit about that representation of the Peaks, for example, at Greg's museum, but also that connection to, as Donna pointed out, the sometimes ugly history. Does anybody want to talk about that? It may not be something you're doing at your institution, but maybe it's something you wish you could do and you want to sort of play with it a little bit. That's a bad way of putting it, but you want to bring it up and have some discussion. Anybody?
I guess I'll
go ahead.
Nope. So in my institution, we have a permanent exhibit, and we do temporary exhibits. And in the permanent exhibit, we touch very loosely on some hard issues regarding race riots that were in our community at the turn of the century. But I've never been happy with how the case was handled, or how that area was handled. And so that's something that I've always wanted to handle it better. There's no context there, because originally we were supposed to be somewhere where people would go through with docents, and it didn't end up that way. And just a couple of weeks ago, I had somebody post I had shared about a new donation that we had, just completely unrelated. And somebody commented, well, you have a KKK robe in your on display in your museum, and that's disgraceful. And I came through with my family, and we were appalled. And I said, I'm very sorry. We do have text there that talks about turn of the century tensions. But I said, I'm sorry, it doesn't handle it quite right. It doesn't put things in the right context. And, I apologize that you felt that way. But it raised again for me that I'd always felt like it wasn't handled well. And it's, now that we just opened back up in the last couple of weeks, that's something that I, want to be able to handle better in the future. So, not getting it quite right.
For those of you that want to talk about COVID, we do have a couple of questions in the discussion. I don't want to cut off a this topic too abruptly. So I do promise I will come back to it. We will talk. I would be remiss, and Tim Daly would be very upset with me if I didn't bring up monuments. And we've talked about this in the past as being the weaponization of history. So how do we address that in our communities, and how do we come back the other direction? And if it's weaponizing history against people, how do we weaponize history for people? So is that something we should be doing? Is it not? We'll discuss that more in a little bit, but I want to do what we've all been doing lately and pivot. I'd like to pivot to the COVID pandemic. We have a point in from Elizabeth. Is anyone doing projects to directly alleviate community issues that are COVID related that might stem off mission but are important? She's seen suggestions for museums to do this, but hasn't seen any examples. So she's curious if anyone has had experience with that. And then I'd also like to bring into the fold the question from Leslie on how the pandemic has affected members. It's affected all of our members everywhere. So how do we have our members feel that there's a value to their membership? She's had that as a response for membership. The compromise of extending memberships and allowing them first access to your site and that kind of thing can make them feel special. What other ways can members feel value from our organizations during this time without risking their safety? So I will open the floor to anyone that wants to talk about how they've pivoted, success or failure. We learn from both, and specifically in relation to the COVID pandemic. Anybody want to jump in with how they've been treating their members? I see Christina's hand.
So I would have to say that we did not extend memberships, and we did not do anything different with our membership program, really. And I think part of that was because we immediately did all of our programming went to online. So the members were still getting the discussion groups and the lectures and so forth in an online version. And so they were able to take advantage of that. And we've even increased some memberships because of that, particularly with our August lecture. But in addition to that, we have also started doing walking tours, and which puts people outside, and really the one that we're doing here in Walnut Hills really integrates abolitionist and African American history within Walnut Hills, which is, both topics are very germane to both our particular mission and the whole neighborhood itself. So we've offered the same amount of engagement even in an online version, and we've increased programming to walking tours as well. So we have not changed the membership program at all, and we have received no pushback. No one has said, why are you not doing that? Because I guess they realize that, it's, and a lot of people have been even like, we want to continue to, I've gotten, some people who give an extra gift and say, to help you through these kind of times, or, that kind of stuff as well. So I would have to say, luckily, we have not had to change anything with membership overall. I don't know if that's, a common experience or if that's kind of unusual for us.
And I think that's a really good point, Christina, that you brought up, and also Leslie too, is that, we were talking about relevance before in a very theoretical way, but what we hear from our members during COVID directly ties to whether or not they feel that your institution is relevant to them and to their community. What Christina's experienced was apparently what they offer, what they do has remained at the same level of relevance to their members. So there wasn't a need to right now in any way to change. But what if, you know, you have the experience that Leslie has where people drop their memberships because they no longer saw as what you were offering was what they needed. And that goes back to the other question that popped up about, you know, is now the time to consider other ways to make those community support options that may be slightly off message, but are needed at this point. So, you know, what are thoughts around that? I mean, have other people experienced a loss of members during this time? You can raise your physical hand because I am seeing those a lot better than I am the other ones. So Stacey's seeing a decrease. Anybody else losing members over the summer? No? Oh, there's Elizabeth. Okay.
We actually had a membership drive. So this was a banner year for us. We had every program, everything was cooking. We had grants coming in. We had a house tour coming up. It was huge for us, and everything got thrown right down the toilet. The big thing that people saw was our house tour. It's biannual. Every 2 years, we have this house tour that brings in a big chunk of change for us. So we went to our board, who generally we asked them to go sell 10 tickets to the house tour. We asked them this year instead to either sell or purchase 10 memberships, and to have those that they had to either sell 10 memberships or sell and donate, or donate the amount for 10 general memberships. We've had a mixed response. Some of our older board members have said, you know, when my kids were in school, I could have sold 10 memberships yesterday. Now I can't. So I'm just giving you this check. And we say, that's great. Thank you for the check. We will gift 10 memberships to someone, or, you know, we're happy to use that to supplement. So we've had a good response there. We're happy that some of those board members have just made a donation, even though we're more happy with members, because at the same time, we send out a mailing to Century Homes. We send out to every house in Lakewood that is turning 100, 110, 120 years old, a birthday card, a little certificate that says, you know, congratulations on your Century home, and an advertisement for our plaque program. We sell plaques that celebrate your house's 100 years. The 1920s were the boom year for Lakewood, so we sent 1,000 mailers out. In that, we included a $5 membership because my board wanted to give them away free to every one of those 1,000 people. And I said, do you realize I have to send out 1,000 renewals in a year, and how much that's going to cost? So we did $5, which will cover their newsletter cost, and we'll take a little bit of a hit in the renewal. So it's been really good. We haven't had 1,000 people come in, which is okay, really, because 1,000 people all at once is tough. But we have increased our membership by about 60 people. And the drive isn't over yet. The board members still have another month to finish out their 10. So we're expecting, you know, we were estimating around 300 people, new members, and we're doing pretty well on that. So we went the other direction. We're hoping that they then see value, that all of these things we were going to do this year can actually happen next year. But we've also been leaning heavily on we can't do anything, help us. We swear we'll get back to you. So that's where we are at as a counter to losing memberships.
So thinking about, again, these sort of bigger picture things, is the idea, and maybe this is where you're jumping into the chat and sharing some questions, but you know, I want to keep us thinking about those sorts of big picture changes that we need to tackle as an industry to stay on the forefront for the future, you know, so that we don't have this one-time dip or one-time gain, but how do we create the sustainability that we need to move forward. So thinking about some of these examples that we talked about for this time during COVID, you know, are there, Scott Britton put on in the chat about how he's going to be doing an article relating the pandemic to the Spanish flu, and how can we, you know, share with our members, our visitors, some sort of historical perspective so that they understand sort of what's going on, that there's that connection piece. How are folks, or are folks moving that way, or are you staying? What am I trying to ask? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, are there examples of institutions that have decided to take what has been happening this year in 2020 and put it into some historic context so that it is not seen as a disaster, but is seen as a way to become that thought leader, that knowledge leader in your community, that place to go to get information, right? That space where we have a responsibility to the public to share our expertise. And you know, we always talk about connecting, preserving, you know, saving history, but what's that other piece of it, the why? So are folks using this as a time to really dig into the why? Why we're important? Why do we matter? Or do your members just like to come and see your stuff and things? Okay, do we need to stand up and stretch or something? Because y'all are really still, and even the people on video are sort of just sitting there, and it's making me a little nervous, to be kind of honest. Anybody?
We did have Stacey's hand up earlier. Did you want to jump in on the last point or on this one?
Well, I guess these sort of connect a little bit for me. It was sort of to that membership point. You know, we did see some dips at the Ohio History Connection, but we also extended memberships. And I think this idea of, you know, we've talked about this for years and years, the idea of memberships moving from this idea of transactional to more value driven. I think with what, you know, having worked with the Stowe House, where Christina is, talking about how they didn't see that kind of dip and actually had people saying, we know times are tough, here's some extra coin for you. I think they do a nice job of explaining the value of the work that they do. And I think that can become really important. That change doesn't happen overnight. You're still going to have members who are members because they get in for free or because there's a transaction involved. But I also wonder sometimes how much of that is that's what we're most comfortable discussing with folks, is like, well, we do these things, not this is how we're change makers for our communities, or this is the value we provide to this community that we live in. So I think kind of connects those 2 points a bit.
Excellent point. Anyone want to weigh in on that? Christina?
Well, I was actually going to go back to 2 other points because my brain is going in multiple directions because you've talked about so many different things. But one, in terms of kind of relating today to our own story, we find ourselves making at least mild sort of comparisons between COVID and cholera, because cholera was a disease in the 1830s and 40s that nobody knew what caused it, and nobody knew how to treat it, and nobody knew what to do about it, et cetera, except for one guy, but nobody listened to him. So that was, you know, so we do seem to make some comparisons to that in terms of, you know, it gets people going, yeah, just kind of, you know, interacting on a tour. But the other thing that I was going to mention, when people were talking about like community resources and how do you do things that aren't necessarily mission-based and so forth, I would say overall we have not done that, but we're partners with someone who could. So for example, we're in an urban area, so we're very tied into our local neighborhood as much as possible because Cincinnati is all neighborhood driven. So there is a group called the Walnut Hills Resource Task Force. And, you know, the organizer there works at the public library here in the neighborhood. And, you know, she coordinates a lot of resources for elderly community members and different, you know, supplies that people need for various reasons. And although we're not directly tied into that, I think she and I have talked before, and if she needs something, we're someone that could help her with things. So like, for example, one day when she had to work, she couldn't make the deliveries on the food distribution day because we're in a food forest, not food desert, that's what it's called. But there was she needed someone to make a delivery, and I volunteered to go do that. So I think that she knows that we would be a partner if necessary, but it's not our direct, it's not a direct connection for us or a direct thing for us. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Just a couple of points of things that people have talked about. I'm going to stop talking now.
Okay. Would anyone else like to talk about COVID and the COVID response and how they're doing? Does anybody need to just decompress? Is anybody having their board telling them they need to be in the office, but also they need to socially distance and be safe and stay home at the same time? I have that going on. That's fun. Depends on which board member you talk to, which day. So,
Greg.
Natalie.
Okay, so not quite that, but my board wants to figure out how to monetize all the things that we've been doing virtually. And I don't feel comfortable with a lot of it. And things that I've been working on as projects that, I figured out, we can do this and people can do this remotely. And I, working on making oral histories available on YouTube. And he's like, no, let's put those behind a paywall. And I'm like, okay, no, I don't want to do that. So that's the thing that, and I was shared their strategic plan looking forward, and it is very heavily based on hoping that they can monetize things like this that I feel like, and I know that at the beginning of this, I remember going to some webinars where they said, maybe we kind of went about this wrong, that we threw all this content out there and we shouldn't have given it all away for free. But it's really hard to figure out how to monetize. My thought is toss us $1 or $2 and I'll be happy. And he's thinking bigger than that. So that's, something I'm struggling with, that I don't know how much I should fight, or how much if I could give statistics or show them what other people are doing or not doing.
So I see a lot of head nodding. Who else can weigh in on how are you monetizing? How are you getting pressure to monetize? What can we do? Who's up? Anybody jump in?
Okay, I'll go again. So a couple years ago, we had several board members who were like, we need to monetize things more, et cetera, et cetera. And what we settled on that has worked for us is, for some things there is a fee, and that is still true for the online, the online lecture series. So for our lecture series, there is a fee for people who are not members, and if you are a member, encourages membership, then there's no fee. And for our discussion groups, because we want to be as inclusive as possible, there is a suggested donation. So it's an actual number that says your suggested donation is $5. Please pay this. If you're able to do so, please pay this. And or if you become a member, then we won't hit you up for money every time you come to a discussion. So it's a way it has increased the number of memberships, just from the fact that more and more people are starting to come to our programs, or starting to come. If somebody comes to a discussion group 3 times and then they're like, yeah, I should just go ahead and buy a membership. Okay, great. I'll take care of that right now. So it's kind of a in between, or a half and half version. We're monetizing it, but not directly. It's a situation where people donate what they can, but then it also encourages more memberships, which is just a yearly amount that takes the place of a fee for each program, if that helps.
Elizabeth, I saw you were going to jump in.
Oh, I was mostly just going to echo what was being said, that early on in the pandemic, we had very similar conversations, not so much coming from our board, but from the staff, when we were really examining our budget for the year and what virtual programs we could do. I think for us, it came down to more logistics of how we actually charge people to come to some of these programs. Because I know you can use platforms, but you have to pay for those platforms. And at some point, is it break even? But for the time being, we have not charged for our virtual programs. And that has actually, they've drawn in a few members who live away. And this is maybe the first program of ours they've been able to attend in a long time, or some non-members as well. So, long term, you could look at it, you might still be getting monetary value out of that eventually, perhaps. But we are going to be having a special program in November, a trivia night, and that will be our first program that we are going to charge for, because we're hoping people who have played in the past, they know the value of that program, and they would be hopefully willing to pay something similar, and they know that it is somewhat of a fundraiser for us. But we are leaning more toward the side of, if it's an educational program that we would have been doing at the library for free, we're not going to charge for it to be virtual free as well.
Which brings up a question of, if you're working on your budgets right now for next year, so that's planning for 2021, not knowing what the future is, you're being asked to monetize certain activities, but you have to create a budget. You have to have a plan for next year. How are folks handling that? How are you doing it? Do you have any great tips? What's the game plan for 2021?
Anybody find that magic grant well, where we can all just get all the free monies? That's what my board would like to see. Lots more of those. All right, anybody want to jump in? I'll give a couple of seconds to jump in about budgets and getting into the minutia.
So if you don't mind, I'll jump in. I got something about the virtual stuff real quick.
Yeah.
I'm the virtual, I'm trying to remember what my title is now. I'm the virtual events coordinator for the Ohio History Connection. Kind of to echo what Christina mentioned about like charging for virtual events. The thing that I've seen from my experience, and not so much hosting events, but events that I've participated in, is that donation style model, where there's like a $5 or $10 or $15 recommendation. And talking to some colleagues at other organizations, they've often found that in that kind of model, they're getting people given a larger donation than the suggested amount. And definitely, and I think other people can speak to this too, as far as attendance for these events, I mean, we're definitely getting folks participating in events who, for whatever reason, whether it be distance, mobility, participating in our events, that who can't come on site. So that's really awesome.
All right. Okay, so I think we should pivot again. I think we need to pivot back to, I promised we would talk about it, is, we're in this COVID world, and as if that wasn't stressful enough, we all have been, whether you are in a very white community like some people or you're not, you have to address social injustice in America at this moment. Some of that, it's not necessarily race related. We also have, RBG passing away, and we're talking about a woman who, fought diligently for women's rights and women's rights in America, and how have we been at telling that story. There are a lot more groups that are out there that are all, we're now trying to, fill every story in. How do we do that? There's also this other side of, we need to protect these things that we already have, like monuments. Some are great monuments. Some are not great monuments. How do we make those distinctions? How do we tell those stories? And where is the place to tell those stories? we're all, whether we want to think about it or not, kind of have been and have to. So I'd like to hear some thoughts from the group as far as how your community is responding, and how you see your organization's role in your community as part of that response. Who would like to open the floor? Who would like to open the discussion? Anyone?
Well, that's a lot of pressure. I'm happy to talk. I don't know about opening the floor. But I guess it's happened in several different ways, you know, over the course of what has happened. Our organization did release a statement, a position statement, which was very difficult because it was early on when getting our board members together. The conversation would have been much better to have in person. So instead it was sending emails back and forth and not really knowing if you were catching everyone's opinions about it. But we put it out and for the most part had, I would say, positive response or no response. Only one person who directly contacted us with concerns about it. The board has talked about creating a special team to focus more on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and the staff have had conversations as well. But also when we released that statement, we tried to be upfront about what we knew and what we didn't know about racial equality in our own community. And fortunately, we had some history features about like labor protests, about race inequalities and segregated things in the community so that we could say, hey, we know this is an issue and we have to celebrate the town's accomplishments and those great figures as much as these things as well. So we could back up our statement with saying we know about these things and we also know we have a lot more work to do. And right now we're in that we have a lot more work to do stage, but it's kind of happening in these different ways. That's what we've been up to.
Anyone else? I went to a talk years ago by a gentleman named James Lowen. James Lowen, who wrote a book about sundown towns. And the discussion was about recognizing our difficult pasts. We're in organizations that where, like, our mission statement, we are about preserving and promoting the heritage of Lakewood, for the benefit of all. It's all about community pride. And then you have issues that are not something you should have a lot of pride in. So his discussion, and he was a keynote speaker back then, his discussion was, you need to have that open, honest talk in your community. And the first thing you need to do is apologize, but it's not the last thing you do. You need to apologize, you need to recognize it, and then you need to talk about it. And it needs to not be something that is shoved off to the side and, oh yeah, that Grandpa had some other ideas too, but he also worked at the plant. And we're going to talk about the plant and just what he did there, not the other stuff that Grandpa had problems with. That kind of thing is hard. It's a hard discussion for us to have. Monuments in our towns, are popped up in our town squares. It took a committee of business leaders and community leaders that were willing to put up some cash to buy these monuments and put them in the middle of the town. And it was a point of pride for generations. Figuring out why those things were erected may be difficult, but sometimes we know why those things were erected and by who. And it always is this little secret that's in the background of, oh, well, that was meant for, this. Those are the kind of things where we need to start telling those stories. I worked for the Seminole tribe for a while there, and we wanted to have a discussion about Black Seminoles. We had a post. There was the State Museum in Florida had a postcard exhibit, and they had as their, all of their press, everything had a postcard on it with a Seminole family, and there was a Black Seminole in there. And one of the tribal members came up to me and was like, "Hey, that guy owns that guy." And I said, "That postcard is from the 1930s. He said, "That guy owns that guy." And it was this little secret where it was like, well, we need to tell people about this. Nope, don't do that. You're going to ruffle a lot of the wrong feathers. Don't talk about it. It's just something that happened, and some Seminole families were they were a little more remote. They didn't find out that slavery ended, or they didn't care. So that story isn't as prominent or at all existent. It's something difficult. And that's a minority group that is also trying to get out their own story. And they have these, things in their closet. So this is a difficult situation we're in, where we need to look in the back of the closet and see what's there. I know that some of you may be wrestling with that, in a way that is more difficult than others. Some of you may be wrestling with it personally. Others may be wrestling with it where you're trying to go one direction and others in your organization are going another. Your organization might not be ready to talk about those things back in the back of the closet. So that's kind of where we've been talking about the last couple of years of relevance, and how do we have these inclusive stories? How do we make ourselves relevant to an ever diverse population? How do we make our stories fresh? There's nothing more fresh than that thing nobody will talk about for the last 60 years. So this is a touchstone moment. We can go this way, we can go that way. I hope that we will all go in the direction of relevance and having these discussions and making ourselves stronger. But I would very much like to ask if anyone has any more discussion they'd like to have on how that might be difficult. And as a group, maybe we can come up with some ideas to help on how to approach that. Or maybe it's better not to. Maybe it is something where we need to keep our head down right now and just kind of survive and see if we come out on the other side of this thing, still an organization. So there are a lot of difficult decisions to be made. Does anybody have anything they'd like to talk about in regards to difficult situations? Elizabeth?
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm dominating things right now. This is actually jumping back much earlier in the conversation about organizations where there's not a lot of maybe diversity history within your community, but based on our surveys, a lot of the people who support us or come to our programs are, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but they're history nerds. Sometimes they don't really care how relevant things are to your local community. And if you can find other themes in your communities like technology, innovation, industry, anything else that resonates with your community, you can maybe find those stories of diversity through those themes and still connect them and be telling more of those stories.
Thank you. Christina?
I just want to make one other suggestion that goes along with this idea of kind of broadening the scope. And that is, at the Harry Beecher Stowe House, we're proud of the fact that we are, well, proud and kind of a little dismayed that we are the only Ohio History Connection site that is solely named for a woman. Think about that. But in terms of that, it's, women are half of humanity. So here's a suggestion for you, and that is when I talk about the Rankin House, which I do frequently because it's directly connected to us and indirectly connected to us. but I always say the house of Jean and John Rankin. Sometimes I say John and Jean Rankin, but I always say both adult members of that family, because everyone says technically the John Rankin house, but Jean and the girls were just as involved in Underground Railroad activities, and they were the ones that was mending the clothes and making the food and making sure that people were physically able to carry on to the next part of their journey. So, just kind of language like that, which makes sure that you are inclusive of who you are talking about. And I also, whenever I'm talking about Ripley, I also say, and John P. Parker lived on the riverfront and was a formerly enslaved person who was rowing people across the river. So I include as much, kind of informational diversity within the Rankin house that I can, to show that it's not just a one-sided or one part of the picture. And you can do that with everything that you're talking about, places that are, family's historic home. Well, it wasn't just the male of the family that lived there. It was the entire family, including the female head of the household. So just a minor point, but if we're all more inclusive in that kind of language, it would help, more people see that as well. All right, I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. I do want to acknowledge it is 5:30 and technically we end now, but if folks want to stay on for a little bit longer and continue conversation, but if you have to bow out, we totally get that too. I want to build on something Christina said and what Elizabeth talked about. Heritage Village, I'm a volunteer there, and they are doing an event in 2021 that is focused on women, recognizing that over the past decade or whatever, every event that they've done has been centered on the male experience in Ohio history. It's the military, it's the frontiersmen, it's the societal leaders. And so this event that we're planning for next year is looking at the women who made history and recognizing that the small steps, like Christina brings out, mentioning Jean Rankin, but when you are doing your events, how are women portrayed in the event? Are they an afterthought? Are they always relegated to the language of the fan conversation? How are they seen at your space, and where are they included or not included? So it'll be interesting to see how this event does and whether or not it's as popular as some of those older events used to be, because it is focused on women. That's something that Christina brought up, 50% of humanity is female, but it's also generally the women in the household who control the purse strings. It's usually and this is a very narrow view, but it's usually the wife, the mother, who's deciding where to spend those dollars and where to take the family on the weekend. So if you are looking around at your site and there's nothing that will bring in her, you're losing out on a lot of potential visitors. Anyone else? Okay.
So looking at the chat, I just wanted to bring in one other from Jacqueline. We had a comment. The high school that she graduated from is on a site on a farm that was owned by an African-American man who lived there.
Yes.
He's 18.
Yeah, it happened. I didn't even know about this until like 4 years ago, that I took a trolley tour with the Upper Arlington Historical Society, and I found out that the land, that was not just the high school in Upper Arlington, but also there's an elementary school in a park that's nearby, that it was all part of one farm. That was a guy by the name of Pleasant Litchford. And I knew that they had, when they built the high school, the original the building that's on there now is from 1956, and they had I think they found 30, there was a cemetery there, 30 graves, and they thought they got everybody out, and they moved them to other cemeteries in the area or so. But I didn't even know about this for years. I mean, and I've lived in Upper Arlington since 1980, and I went to high school and graduated in 87. I did not know until 2016 about the history of that site. And then it was just recently they had a construction, I guess it was because they're building a new high school on the same site that the old building, they're going to demolish it like next year. And they're building this fancy new building. So they were prepared. They figured, they thought they got all the graves out, and they figured if they shouldn't, just in case they find anything. They had some archaeologists tagging along, and then they found, like, I guess 6 graves in a different part of the site, like not near where the other 30 were originally. And it was like a big show. A lot of people were surprised, and I remember it was in the paper like the next day, and there was a big article about it, and people were talking about it, and the like local not just Upper Arlington, but other historical societies. Like I was at a meeting like the day that story broke, and they were like, "Did you hear what about Upper Arlington?" Like, oh my God, people were like, they were surprised, they didn't know. And Upper Arlington's a predominantly white community. It's like 91% white, and we have a history of like, I guess we had a big history with, unfortunately, with restrictive. There was the legacy of restrictive covenants is responsible for the reason why that demographic is the way it is. That even though it's been, a long time since they've had, they haven't enforced covenants, but they're just like, there's only like maybe a handful. Like my high school, there was only a handful of Black students the whole time I was there. In my class, there were 0 in my graduating class. I mean, the biggest racial minority in Upper Arlington is basically Asians and Indians, but there's not too many. You don't see too many African Americans in Upper Arlington to this day. I mean, I think there's more than there was, but I mean, it's still very, and a lot of that's the legacy of restrictive covenants.
So we do have a push in the local and state legislature to put through a Graves Protection Act. There's a lot of movement on that, crossing our fingers that happens. But it's there are a lot of unprotected graves across the state that are issues that we need to deal with. That's something that the state hasn't dealt with very well.
Yeah.
But that being said, we're coming into a time where it's we can talk about graves for a month here and not only be spreading the word and talking about these kind of things, but also be hip because it's Halloween coming up, right? So we're all trying to figure out our ghost tours and our grave tours and things like that. Something to take note of is, where are your minorities buried in relation to your white population? Is there a big graveyard, in town, but there's also a small one on the edge of town? And boy, why is that? That's something that could be coming out in how we portray, this time of year with our ghost tours and everything like that. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, please, the Graves Work Act that we're working on with the state. I do want to just make sure that we touched on everybody in the chat. There was another one about Native American portrayal and how do you, even if your community is mostly white but are very tied to it. I think of something like the Copley Indians. They are never getting rid of that name as far as I can tell. But so the community is very tied to it, but it is something that is not represented by that group. So we as a state have an issue there. Forever we've been considered the donut hole for Native Americans because of the Removal Act and the way that it went down in the state of Ohio. We do have a session coming up on Friday at 10:30 with Ben Garcia and Stacy Halfmoon about American Indian relation policy and best practices. If you are having those issues, I highly recommend jumping in on that session. It's a very interesting topic that we can all make some headway in.
I do want to say that the question was brought up around inaccurate history that the community is sort of using in that particular situation. And maybe we can, if anybody has any thoughts about that, but I think it was Kyle that put that question on there. Is how do we as an institution sort of course correct? You know, if you are seeing these inaccuracies in the community, you know, what is our role to sort of course correct? How far do we push that course correction? How, without, again, it's always that balance that you have to look at is, you know, donor X loves this collection, even though it's a very historically inaccurate and collection. How do we make that balance? But that was part of his question, was about that course correction. Does anybody want to talk about that a little on that? I'm going back. I think it was Kyle that asked that. Who may not be.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think that per Greg's suggestion, that would be a good one for tomorrow with Ben and Stacy, because, you know, the course correcting doesn't happen overnight. When I look at the work that the Ohio History Connection has done over about the past 11 years, you know, it, you know, took how many generations to kind of get this all wrong. It'll probably take more than a couple to put it right. But I think tomorrow's session may be nice with, like, here are some steps of how to, you got to start somewhere, right? But then also having the appropriate expectations for what that's going to look like. Because, yeah, that's not we could be here for another few hours talking about that one for sure.
Okay, thank you, Stacia.
Okay, well,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say we're getting toward the end of our time. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to put into the chat or to speak up? We are a smaller group now, so if anybody just wanted to come off mute and add anything to the conversation before we wrap things up. Anyone? All right. Well, I'll let Terrie have a last thought here, but I'll throw mine in really quick. You know, we've been pushing each year to think about these issues, and, you know, we were taking a long approach. We were taking the, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. How do we make this happen? It's been interesting to see as we've slammed into a sprint in this last half mile here. So it's something we are all dealing with. And if you ever have anything you'd like to talk about, anything you want to bounce off us, if you feel we need to have a relevance discussion again next year, let us know, because we're definitely in the middle of this and not at the end. So Terrie, your thoughts?
Just to echo what Greg said, that this was not about the short answers, the quick, fast, easy, but a recognition that we are all dealing with this in different ways and different stages. And sometimes you just need to know that other people are dealing with it and that there are folks to reach out to. So certainly get in touch with Greg or I. Don't forget that there is an OLHA members Facebook group that if you're not logged into, you can join that and post these questions and ask for some help. 2020 has had the effect of pretty much goosing us all into making moves that we had not considered. Even if it was to consciously decide not to make changes, you had to ask the question. So I'll be curious to see how we respond to these questions in 2021. So I think that is all I have to say.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Betsy and Matt.
Thank you.
And when you go to join the members Facebook group, there's going to be some questions that you need that it asks you. Please answer them, because it helps tell our social media coordinator whether or not, in fact, you are an Alliance member or a member of an organization that is an Alliance member. So help Mary out and answer those questions but do join the Facebook members group. And if you need to know where to find that, let me know and I can send you the link for it. So thank you.
Our goal is next year in person, possibly with an adult beverage in the lobby, to have this conversation face to face. It's the goal.
And in the meantime, we'll see you all tomorrow at the mixer.
Oh yeah.
Get your beverages.
History Heroes. History's Heroes with whichever beverage or lack of beverage you want to bring. So
Excellent.
5 o'clock.
Thank you all. You have a good night.
Bye.